Hello everyone, good morning or good afternoon, depending where you are joining us from, and welcome to today's session. First, I'd like to thank Ethna for her previous words and introduction. So this session is talking a bit about the development of PPP structures in the region, how that's changed in recent years, and the impact of the obvious the obvious issues you've been facing with COVID and previously the low oil price. And I'm joined by a extremely distinguished panel to discuss this. So we'll talk to the panel first, then there'll be time for questions afterwards. So firstly, Abraham, I'll turn to you with a sort of a specific question first. I mean, I think everybody who's been following PPP projects in the region was very interested to see Oman forming WAPPP last year, and there was a huge amount of activity. And then in the government reshuffle, the WAPPP was subsumed into MOP. So I think many people in the audience would be interested to hear an update from you as to what's happening with WAPPP in its new home, and what are the plans for the large slate of projects which you had ready to go.
Thanks, Thomas, for the question. And basically, in July 2019, the Public Authority for Privatization and Partnership was established in Oman under the PPP framework, which included a PPP law, a PPP pipeline, and an authority. And we were busy for almost 13 months, rolling out a program with around 50 projects in our pipeline. Around 10 projects were our priority project, and some of the audience probably have heard about the advertisement for advisors for some of these projects. And in August of this year, the government of Oman reshuffled and rescheduled a lot of the authorities and government entities into smoother government, and our authority, along with several other authorities and councils and government companies, were dissolved and merged into other government entities. So we are now housed within the Ministry of Finance as a PPP team. But the PPP law, the pipeline of PPP projects are still intact. It is business as usual. In a way, it gave us an opportunity now to be able to get things a little bit faster in terms of approvals, given that we're part of Ministry of Finance. But at the same time, it is getting us now to redefine our governance process. But as far as the project, as far as the pipeline, as far as the priorities, they are still the same. And I will sprinkle my discussion today and mention some of these projects throughout the questions and answers. We are expecting to launch the first wave of 4 projects in the new year. We got approvals for the first 4 projects to be launched in terms of finding transaction advisors, or actually in one case, rolling out an RFP for a developer investor in Q1 of 2021. So business as usual, a small hiccup on the road, but no big changes and no change in policy or direction.
Thank you, Abraham. Well, I'm sure many people in the audience will be very pleased to hear that it's kind of business as usual, and we will be seeing a resumption of the activity which we saw previously in the near future. That's very good news. Thank you. Moving on to the sort of the advertised topic, and following on from what Abraham said, and I think those who have followed the Oman's program up until now, it's extremely broad, operating from transport projects through to port projects, healthcare, education. So I'd like to ask David Baxter, which sectors do you think are most suited to PPP developments? And are there any sectors which history suggests PPP structures do not work well for?
Good morning and good afternoon. I completed a survey amongst practitioners from around the world in May, and I got responses from 70 countries, and I asked that question specifically, what sectors are most promising? And I also added the caveat if people could explain that within a sort of a post-COVID world, which ones were going to be of great interest to developers, investors, and governments. Obviously, there were certain sectors that were hit hard. I think the one that was hit the hardest was the transportation sector. If you just think of airports, which suddenly lost all their passengers, metro systems around the world where people were too scared to use them. And so one of the areas that people were most concerned about in the future forward-looking approach was, transportation. However, there were other sectors which were highlighted, which global experts and practitioners and governments around the world indicated to me are very promising in the post-COVID world. And I don't think they come as a surprise, but they are there. One was healthcare, obviously. That is a tremendous focus because the COVID pandemic revealed many inefficiencies, shortcomings in the healthcare sector. So even though it was recognized by respondents around the world as being the most under threat, it was also identified as the one that was the most needed, and that was right on the top of the list. And that's everything from hospitals to clinics to not just infrastructure, but also to social services. The second one, which was very high on the list, was obviously that which was information technology, digital networks, etc. And I think one can understand why that is also important because of the way business has changed and how people have been forced to, and businesses have been forced to work from remote locations. And as a result, many countries have also realized that they have bandwidth issues. They don't have the infrastructure in place. This wasn't a priority just caused by the pandemic as well. The Global Infrastructure Hub, which was formed by the G20 nations, focused on the year 2020, this year, as the digital infrastructure focus year. So this was on the radar screen of very many developers. It varies between countries, however, and I noticed this when I desegregated the information down to continents and regions. And really what is driving it above that are specific concerns driven by the commitment to sustainable development goals of each country, because each country has different needs. And also it's also tied, I think, very closely to one aspect that people are also forgetting, and this kind of got shrouded, is the whole idea of global climate change, or adverse weather events, if you want to call it that. So certain countries are extremely susceptible to climatic conditions and are trying to mitigate those impacts. I think in the GCC region or the Middle East, MENA, even wider, water projects will continue to be of considerable importance, especially along the lines of desalinization. So if you had to prioritize them, and then not to forget also education, especially now, again, with remote learning. And so those are the most priorities. Concerning two that were very high up in the rankings previously, transportation. Transportation hasn't gone away, but there's a greater focus now on smart transformation, on transportation to ensure that it's done better. And then tourism. I was very surprised that tourism dropped on the list. And if you think of in Saudi Arabia, there's a tremendous interest in improving tourism through PPPs, etc. And that. But the caveat was that, again, we also need to look at green, smart tourism PPPs.
Thank you, David. I suppose a panel of PPP professionals are unlikely to be fulsome about projects which don't work under PPP structures. Abraham, you've been on both sides of the fence. Is there anything you think particularly doesn't work, or do you think PPP is flexible enough to work in virtually anything?
Well, I mean, I wouldn't say it doesn't work. It's ill-conceived projects, even in the sectors that David mentioned, which are the priority sectors, even in Oman, the health, education, ICT, and I'm going to add a little bit on sanitation in general, wastewater and environmental are priority. So it's not about which sector doesn't work, it's more whether the project is well conceived. Obviously, the sectors that usually are tougher is if you're breaking into a new sector where it hasn't been done before, you're pioneering in a nuclear energy, for example, was very tough in a couple of countries previously. So it's more about the traditional sectors. It should work if the right framework is in place, if the right legislation, and if the project has had a good preparation and private sector readiness to deliver it. So I'm a firm believer that well-conceived projects have a high probability of success. The ones that haven't succeeded are the ones that have not been well prepared, well designed, and the private sector wasn't ready to take on the risk. So much risk was put on the private sector. So volume risk these days in transportation will be extremely difficult to shift to the private sector, as David mentioned, whether it's an airport or toll roads or the like. But I believe we've seen an interest in marine and ports and transportation logistics. Places like Oman are well positioned to take advantage, and we've had an increase in throughput in Oman and logistics.
Thank you. So, Ziad, one point Abraham made there was, ill-conceived projects don't work, where well-conceived ones do, irrespective of the sector. What advice would you give to governments seeking to launch PPP programs in the current environment?
It's a broad question. I can talk for the next half hour about this, but
make my job very easy, yes.
So maybe I'll try to be as succinct as I can. But I do want to mention before that I think that governments should take into consideration what is happening, because I'm concerned that most governments around the world still have not adjusted to the new reality. They have these pipelines. This is my pipeline. This is what I'm doing. My projects are behind. But as soon as things get better, I'm going to continue with my pipeline. It may work for some countries, but I think for many countries, they would be missing a huge opportunity to take a step back and review their pipeline in light of the pandemic, in light of the current economic circumstances. So for example, healthcare is important. Maybe it has taken on more importance today, but how much investment do countries need in healthcare? How much in new technology? It's as David was saying, IT is very, very important to the modern economy today, especially after COVID. So do I build another power plant, or do I invest in 5G? Maybe it's a wrong comparison, but I think that's the idea. So I think governments should take a step back and really look again at the SDGs. For a long time, for many years now, governments have signed up to the SDGs, but they give them short shrift and just lip service. And they go on doing PPP projects according to this ministry's priority or that ministry's priority. And the Minister of Public Works wants a road, and the Minister of Health wants a hospital. And that's not the right way to do it. So they need to take a step back, look at all the SDGs, and formulate a plan that really is a strategy. So it's not about like in ports, what port specializes in what is my strategy for ports, but go beyond that. Do I need to invest in ports today or not? And these are the kinds of questions that governments are still not grappling with, I think, today. They need to stop thinking of PPPs as a procurement method. They need to start thinking of PPP as a tool for development. And as long as they're not thinking about it that way, and as long as they're not looking at, the ESG dimension and the people first dimension and all the social aspects and the impact on the environment and all of those things, they may be very happy to inaugurate the project, but these are long-term projects and there will be consequences. There's a lot more I want to say, but I'll continue when my turn comes back again. I don't want to monopolize the panel.
Thank you, Ziad. Well, certainly the plea for sort of joined up thinking across governments is something which I'm sure everybody around the table would support. So I'm sort of linked to that question then. I mean, one of the things which I think governments often do to demonstrate that they are thinking about this and they're taking it seriously is to sort of launch a PPP law or a PPP unit. So, David, do you think PPP laws and sort of standalone PPP units, do they actually help? I mean, there are numerous examples of countries who have had very successful PPP programs without these laws and entities. Do you have any views on that?
Yes, I do. So, for example, a country that's been extremely successful with PPPs but doesn't really have a national PPP unit or a readily identified PPP law is Turkey. They have, however, very strong ministries with strong PPP units, if you want to call that, within each of those ministries, with very clear guidance that has been set up. And this has enabled Turkey to implement a very large PPP program. In many discussions that I've had with the private sector, one of the things that they always say they look at and they want to understand and want to know is whether there's a strong enabling PPP environment, or let's call it a legal framework, and then also a body which is in charge of PPP practice guidelines overall in a country, so that they don't get surprised every time they go to a different ministry or the rules are rewritten while they are bidding. And so in countries which have very, very inclusive PPP units, I would call that, where they work with all the different ministries and they come up with laws which then have the spin-offs, which are actually more important, are the guidelines which are used to implement PPPs. It introduces a great sense of comfort into the market. And so you can have these situations where it's successful. There are certain countries, however, that PPP units have gone through some hard times, and especially in some of the MENA region countries in the last few years, they have been slightly neglected and are restructuring, reorganizing themselves. I think Oman did a wonderful exercise last year. It was the PPP law was very, very useful to interested parties because it defined the whole approach. WAPPP was a good organization to set up, but as Abraham explained, it's still there, just under another name and under another guise, and it's under the Ministry of Finance, which I think is a good place for it to be. Often the question is asked, where should PPP units be located? Some in the Treasury, some in the Ministry of Planning, if you look at different countries, and some in the Ministry of Finance. But I think a very good place for it is the Ministry of Finance. So to end my question, yes, we do need PPP laws or an enabling environment because it defines the practice and the rules and it provides protections to all. And we do need a PPP unit because it can be the guiding organization, the gatekeeper. As Abraham said, it can help ensure that good projects that have merit are carried forward and those that aren't are screened out. And it introduces cohesiveness to a national program, which can result in a pipeline which people will respect and know is supported by the national government of that country.
Sure, yeah. I suppose it goes to the general attractiveness, and I think something which, again, is sometimes a struggle for governments is to realise that it's a competitive environment. People, for investors, people don't have to invest in your country. They will choose to if the environment is attractive enough and the projects are, as we've talked about, well designed and interesting. Thank you, David. So, linked to that, then I think we touched on this. What governments should do. The obvious counterpart to that is, what do sponsors and developers look like? So, Abraham, having spent a large part of your career advising private sector entities, what would you say private sector entities really look for in projects at the moment?
Well, international players usually look for well-conceived projects, as David said, a good framework, with a law, without a law, some legislation to be put in place, some precedent to be put in place. As international players have the ability to go and look for different countries around the world. The private sector, I used to work for a private sector developer for 5 years throughout my career, where we used to have these questions, and I used to call them the go and the get, which is the project gonna go ahead? and what the likelihood of the project will go ahead till the end, i.e. it's not a fishing expedition. And the other question was the get. Can I get that project? So it's very important as part of a project preparation as practitioners that we spend enough time listening to the market, doing market sounding and the like as part of project preparation to ensure that we're going to be able to attract the right companies. And one cautious point that I would like to add for the private sector, that the old days of having very high returns may be not in place anymore. So there should be a better balancing of risk transfer. And we're using COVID in Oman to do exactly what Ziad said, to do some of the stuff that David said, which is recalibrating our priorities, looking at not necessarily lots of bricks and mortars, because I think it's more services, ICTs, all the stuff that will impact the health sector, the education sector. So private sector need to as well be ready to start looking at very innovative ideas, whether it is latest design technology, latest construction, 3D construction that we are talking about in a couple of our projects. And they have a role to play in advocating these and putting, knocking on the doors of the government saying we can do it differently than the way you have been putting requirements out. So I'm a very firm believer that the next wave of PPPs, whether it's Oman or in other countries, they're going to look different. The delivery is going to look different. The service richness may look different. The risk transfer will look different. And the private sector needs to elevate their entry into these things and become more agile and look for a different way to deliver projects.
Thank you, Abraham. One thing which Abraham touched on, we've touched on a couple of times, is COVID, and I'm sure every session of this event will mention COVID at some point. So let's jump on that bandwagon. Ziad, PPP projects are generally long term. They generally require you to take a look into the future, and at the moment that's particularly hard given the level of uncertainty we're all faced. So what do you think well, again, this is another question with a potentially very long answer, but what do you think the impact of COVID-19, and particularly when you consider that piled on top of the low oil price environment which the Middle East has been facing for some time now, what do you think impacts this will have on the region's PPP projects?
Well, it is sort of the usual thinking goes that because the oil revenues decline, then the governments need the private sector to step in and invest in infrastructure when their budgets shrink. I think that there are many things that are happening now that we need to keep into consideration. First, let me say that the oil prices are not necessarily going to stay low. We've seen that as soon as a vaccine was announced, oil prices jumped 5% in one day. So, as soon as the world economy recovers, things are going to change. That is good and bad for PPPs because we were talking about the importance of having PPP legislation and PPP units in place. And this is extremely important, as David was saying. But it is a necessary but not sufficient condition. There are other aspects, and here I tie in that conversation with COVID in saying that financing is crucial. There is no way that you can have any successful program without PPP program without being able to attract sufficient financing. We know, and this is pre-COVID, that the deficit for financing infrastructure by governments around the world, according to the World Bank, in the next 10 years is about $15 trillion. So we were already talking before COVID of the need to really think about how this gap is going to be bridged. Can the private sector come up with $15 trillion? And we know that this is going to be very difficult. So companies are going to be choosy. They're going to go to governments countries that have stable political systems. They're going to go to where there's more certainty about the go aspect that Abraham was talking about, that the projects are going to get done. There's going to be a lot of competition there was already going to be a lot of competition for private sector resources. This has become even more so today because all governments around the world have spent inordinate amounts of money on social programs and activities to deal with COVID. It is even developed countries now are having national debt to GDP ratios above 100%. So they are going to be very, very restricted, not because only of drop of oil prices, but everywhere because of COVID. They're going to be very restricted on government financing, and therefore more need for private sector financing, and therefore more competition for the scarce resources of investors. So I think that one advice I have is for governments, especially to really empower their PPP units. Stop this thing about the minister this and the minister that. Let professionals handle this. The PPP units should take an active role in cultivating relations with investors. So even before they have a project, maybe, or when they're thinking in the early stages of projects, start talking to investors in that sector, cultivating relationships, taking into consideration where the investors stand. It's not just as usually is the case. It's a bureaucracy. We sit in the government's office and we work on a tender. That cannot work in the future. There needs to be more a business-like approach, like a private sector entity would do. Again, I have a lot more to say, forgive me, but I will stop here.
No, thank you, Ziad. Well, again, it's a kind of another side of the joined-up thinking in government approach, isn't it? Which I think is a clear requirement. David, is there anything else you'd like to add? I was intrigued by Ziad's point about the fact that people have lower budgets might actually drive further PPP projects because the money isn't there for capital programs, so you have to turn to PPP.
Yeah, one thing I would point out, I think both speakers have alluded to, that investors are not sentimental. And so they are going to look at countries where they are going to have stability, where there's going to be a practice or best practice that ensures that they're not going to have headaches trying to work on the PPPs. It is a long-term commitment. So, PPPs can be 20 to 30 years in duration. So there's a great focus there on, the need for stability. I think also that PPPs are a great source of innovation from the private sector. And this is really important. I don't want to say that the public sector is not innovative, but it's driven by different rules. Its operating culture is different. Profit isn't a focus. It's very bound by, bureaucracy, red tape, as was mentioned. While the private sector, when it is introduced into the equation, brings innovation, it also brings alternative financing, it brings business rigor to enterprises. And I think that's one of the reasons that it is successful. They also understand risk and are very focused on risk, because risk will impact their bottom line. There's one thing that I did want to point out, that often there are accusations that the private sector might make too much profit. And I've heard people saying that PPPs are dangerous because it results in nationalization of debt and privatization of profit. This is not, we shouldn't have that mindset, for one simple reason, that if the private sector does make a profit, that's the incentive for them to perform well. And if you take that incentive away from them, then they're going to operate pretty much like the public sector does in many countries. So, the private sector needs the public sector, otherwise it hasn't got a business. The public sector needs the private sector, otherwise it doesn't have the resources. And I think PPPs are a great opportunity for both sectors to leverage each other's resources to identify sustainable, reasonable projects that are bankable, which offer value for money, value for people, value for the future, which are future-proofed, and can solve many countries' problems.
Thank you, David. Sort of a question, so a bit more detail on the impact of COVID. I think still across the region, by value, the vast majority of PPP investment structured on a PPP basis are in the power and water sector. And these projects have been very successful, and they've been going since the mid-90s, with Manna in Oman being the first. So, we're out sort of 20 plus years into this. And, I think around the region, you're seeing those structures mature and change, and often to the benefit of procurers. So now it's relatively common not to see government guarantees. So with the impact of COVID and the whilst it's nice to see Ziad is quite bullish on oil prices, but there are many who aren't. So with the impact of COVID and the reduction perhaps in budgets and thus probably an increase in risk, I'd be interested in the panel's views on any sort of changes to the financing which we're going to see in these projects. I mean, are lenders and sponsors going to require different security packages or more comfort from governments before they will be willing to sign up to these projects? Abraham, I'd be interested in your views on that initially.
I mean, if all these projects that we're talking about will require government guarantees, they're not going to get it. I'm being very blunt, because there isn't enough to put all these guarantees in place. So we need to find innovation. We need to find other instruments to provide the surety and the security that these projects will need, whether it's insurance or other instruments, in order to be able to do more. The government, as Ziad said, they're very much in debt. If they keep putting these guarantees in place, they're not gonna be able to implement these projects. I believe the government, through either internal funds that they have, whether it's an investment arm of the government or an infrastructure fund or the like, could play a role, as we've been trying to advocate over the last 10 years. I've been advocating that in the region as anchor equity player on some of these projects, where the government puts their money to facilitate the project's implementation by using their instruments. Most of the countries in the GCC have set up sovereign wealth fund, and they've invested abroad. So there's no reason why they can't use some of that to bring it in-house into their own countries and use that as a lever into becoming equity player in some of these projects. Maybe the returns won't be as interesting as they have been around the world, but it is an instrument that they have in their toolbox. Secondly, the private sector, as David said, I echo that, they need to start pushing the governments in terms of new ideas. And it's not all the time that they have to look for guarantees. There could be certain risk allocation that will make the private sector more interested. For example, let's use Oman and the power sector, where a lot of the BOOs or BOTs are coming to an end. And there's no reason to transfer them back right away or stop the work on it. There could be opportunities to extend these contracts, albeit you've already paid for the asset. It becomes more an operating contract. There may be some of these assets that could have value outside the current contractual arrangement. So I urge a lot of government that have utility projects that are coming to an end to look at them again and recalibrate them, and hopefully find ways to extend the life of these assets and bring more value than to the users by lowering the costs.
Okay, Abraham. A plea for innovation and sort of lateral thinking from developers and procurers. Ziad, is there anything you'd like to add to that on the way financing and security packages and government support is going to look like in the future?
Well, countries in the region, in the MENA region, are sort of two types generally. I mean, one, you have the GCC countries that have a certain profile when it comes to financing and financial needs, and then you have the non-oil producing countries, and they are not in the same. They don't have the same problems, let's say. So the non-oil producing countries are typically dependent on World Bank and EBRD, and sometimes they are happy to get some Chinese financing because they really don't have access to the international capital markets. And they don't have access to international capital markets usually, I mean, the common way of thinking is they don't have access because they, you know, the credit rating of the country or things like this. But I personally don't believe that's, I'm not saying it's not true, but I'm saying it's not the entire truth. Because if you look at Latin America, for example, Latin America doesn't have governments or countries with much better ratings than the MENA region countries do. And yet they are very smart about getting private sector financing, having access to capital markets. Places like Brazil or Colombia or Mexico or even smaller countries, they have developed local capital markets. But they're not only dependent on local capital markets, they just have very interesting and innovative financial instruments. And they've been doing this since the 1980s. In the MENA region, we're still very stultified in, you know, this unidimensional thinking of, I'm going to give the mandate to the IFC because if I don't give it to the IFC, I may not get any investors. And this has a lot to do in a way with not only the psychology and mentality of people in public sector in the MENA regions, but also with the relative inexperience of the people who are in the PPP units in the region. So you have people who have, unlike Latin America, where there's depth of experience in PPP projects, you have people who may have taken some courses about PPP, who may have sat the CP3P exam and gotten their certificate of qualification, but they've really never worked on PPP projects. They really haven't worked on difficult PPP projects that require creative thinking. Now, this is why I urge the governments of the region, especially the PPP units, to do like what Oman did and retain somebody like Abraham Akkawi, who has a wealth of experience and who can come in and help these PPP units, you know, act like an internal mentor. It is not enough to sort of say, I have a project and then put out a tender and then, you know, get one of the big consulting firms to come and help you do the project. Getting one of the big consulting firms means, by definition, even though that's not what they say in their proposal, you're going to get the junior staff. You're going to get the junior team. There's always bait and switch. And the junior team is not much smarter than you are. So you need seasoned people. You need to retain seasoned people that come in and perhaps not work with you on a project, but advise the unit overall as a whole. And I think, you know, like I said, Abraham's case with Oman was very smart of the Omanis to do that. I urge other governments to do the same.
Thank you, Ziad. I was hoping to get another couple of questions, but I think we're running out of time. So what I'll do, I'll ask the panelists if they've got any other last comments they'd like to make. David, is there anything you'd like to add?
I think we need to remember that PPPs require long-term commitments, and that means that we have to future-proof them and we have to future-proof our practices. And all I can say is, you know, once the COVID pandemic is passed, don't revert back to bad behavior, because there will be future events that will happen and it'll be sad to restart again.
Thank you, David. Abraham, any final comments from you?
Well, first, thank you, Ziad, for the compliment. Yes, absolutely. I think post-COVID or the next wave of project, government needs to start thinking about being nimble. Don't roll out your PPP program with the biggest projects that you have, especially if you haven't done any projects. So go with medium-sized projects, smaller projects. Try to cultivate your local community in terms of whether the contractor, developers, to be able to get them interested in these projects. Yes, get international players to come in on medium-sized projects, but don't go after the largest project. I spent 2 years of my career working on one of the largest transportation projects in the region. It still has not seen the light of a procurement. So go nimble. Don't think that, you know, because you are an oil-rich country, you can attract everybody who's coming, who wants to come to the region at any price. So we have to be very nimble, and we have to be realistic that money moves around to the best project.
May I add something? I know we're out of time, but I would be remiss not to do a plug for WAPPP. Join WAPPP, the World Association of PPP Units and Professionals. It's a great hub for all professionals in the region and around the world to exchange experience and improve their careers.
Thank you all. Thank you, Ziad, for that. Well, we will tootle off and join WAPPP, I'm sure. So thank you, everybody. Thank you to the three panelists for an interesting, what I hope was an interesting discussion. I certainly enjoyed it. Well, in summary, I think a plea for joined-up government, a requirement for well-conceived projects, and I was particularly interested by the discussion on innovation in financing. And I think the kind of the standard requirements which banks always insist on, must have a government guarantee, etc., maybe needs to be rethinking. And some of the points Abraham made were particularly interesting on that, with sovereign wealth funds maybe coming in to assist in mitigating the risks. So thank you, you three, and we'll have some questions shortly.
Hello there, and thank you so much for that panel. They're really a great focus, a very dynamic focus on public and private partnership in terms of what needs to be done, what is being done, and again, looking to the future on that. So a big thank you, David. Ziad, Abraham, thank you so much. And Thomas, of course, thank you so much for moderating that panel. Thomas, I'd like to begin by asking you, and a quick reminder to all of our viewers out there, please add a few more questions. We have a tremendous panel here, some great brain power for the next 15 minutes. So do take the time and let's put a few questions to them. But Thomas, if I might bring you into the panel too at this point, why do you think that we're seeing such growth in the use of PPP structures to deliver infrastructure, particularly in the region?
Sure. Yes, thank you for the question. Yeah, I mean, I think it's driven by a few things. I think probably the most pressing one is probably budgetary. Much as in Europe, where people are driven to using PPP structures because of a lack of money, essentially. The Middle East is facing similar pressures at the moment, but I think also it's to do with quality of services. And the most Gulf jurisdictions have young growing populations, and they have an expectation of receiving high quality health, education, and other services. And PPP has been demonstrated around the world to be a very good mechanism for delivering high quality services at an economic price and efficiently.
And indeed, yes, I mean, that's ultimately, I think we've seen it in countries around the world, and it's something that, quite honestly here, it will work. And I think we're probably going to see more of it. David, if I might bring you in, the first IPP and IWPP projects, they're really coming to an end at the moment here. How do you see governments, around the world in any different countries handling this right now? David, we have just a little technical problem there. We'll get the mics working here. There you go.
Just to talk broadly about PPPs and how governments are handling these projects that are reaching the end of their term, it's interesting that many governments around the world, especially those in Eastern Europe, were very eager to launch PPPs when the Iron Curtain came down. And we're entering into that phase now 30 years after. And they were more focused on launching PPPs and really didn't consider what would happen when PPP terms expired and then these projects started coming back to the government, because PPPs are, it's not handing over and giving it away. It's still, the infrastructure still remains the property of the government. And so many PPP units and governments are not prepared, are overwhelmed, and didn't think this through carefully. So if I could give advice, it is critically important that you as a government consider, what are we going to do in 30 years' time when it comes back? And do we even want that project to come back to the government? Because if we don't, then we should maybe be considering full privatization and not a PPP.
Abraham, if I can bring you in on this question as well, and particularly now looking at what's going on, in Oman and in the region as well, particularly with the initial offtake agreements and concessions, coming to an end, but actually probably some of them even just starting here.
Yeah, I believe the status specifically on the power and the water sector are interesting challenges, as a lot of these projects are coming to an end, or they'll come to an end in the next 4 or 5 years. I believe it's an opportunity for the government to relook at the need for these projects and recalibrate how much capacity they need, given that they all signed to some kind of aggressive renewable strategies. And Oman is not any different from other countries. We built a lot of power plants through PPPs or BOTs or BOOs. And we need to be as well mindful that there's a lot of costs associated with the offtake agreements. And I think the procurer should look at different strategies in terms of a few years before they expire. One could be, should we renew them and at what cost? Should we stretch the capital cost over a long period of time, specifically on the BOOs where they're gonna end and they're gonna be dismantled eventually? Is that the best thing to do? When it comes to the BOTs, as David said, we need to rethink whether we need these power plants and at what cost we need them. So I believe it's an opportunity, given a couple of things happening, and COVID is one of them. The demand for power has maybe gone lower, as well as the aggressive solar and in some countries wind opportunities should provide a chance for the procurers to relook at the whole planning for power capacity and water capacity. And we are doing exact same thing in Oman, looking at early termination, looking at expansion, looking at extending some of these contracts. All of these are on the table in order to alleviate the fiscal pressure on not only the budget, but on the capacity.
Ziad, when we look at the importance of ESG and we look at the importance in all sectors, and particularly big construction, infrastructure, energy section, all of that too. And again, when investors are looking at how they're going to invest, ESG absolutely essential, but are governments actually taking it seriously enough? Ziad, what do you think?
Unfortunately, so far, governments have not become as serious about ESG as some investors have been. They still don't realize that there's some $40 trillion worth of financing. There's financing available for ESG projects, and there are rating agencies like Fitch and others that are rating projects for ESG. There's people like Bloomberg and that are also involved in that. There's software that can help the governments design their projects in such a way that they can be ESG compliant. So they're not taking advantage of those trillions of dollars that are out there that are looking for projects. And governments have traditionally, I think now, internalized the equator principles that have existed for a long time and are required by entities like the multilateral development banks to finance projects. There's now some 97 financial institutions, large financial institutions around the world that require projects to comply with equator principles. But there's also 49 stock exchanges around the world that are now publishing data on ESG. So if you're already working on something that is equator principle compliant, you're close to ESG, you might as well qualify your project for that. It takes a little bit of time. Governments, usually political decision makers, are in a hurry. They don't want to wait for this process to take place, but hopefully with more awareness, they could be made aware of the need for that in order to secure low-cost financing in an environment where governments are going to be competing very heavily against each other for financing in a post-COVID era. And it also, I should mention, it ties in with People First PPP principles that are promoted by the United Nations and by the quality infrastructure investing principles that are promoted by the G20. So if governments become conscious of ESG, I think it would be great for them, great for their projects, and makes for not only cheaper financing, but successful long-term projects.
Abraham, perhaps if I can bring you in on this one, and when we, talk about ESG, and you mentioned, in your conversation there that it really is about project preparation and how essential this is. Maybe that's a time where governments have to look at ESG, but also in terms of, making sure that everything is prepared in advance in terms of speed, efficiency, taking into consideration all of those requirements, as they really are now. and really hoping, delivering on time, on budget, but delivering a future-proof project, so to speak. Abraham.
Yes, thank you. Throughout my 30 years working in the field, I come across governments all over the world who are very pressured to go to market. And we've seen a lot of projects that gone to market too early without enough preparation or without enough viability assessment, just for the sake of satisfying some political masters or satisfying some ego of some of the bureaucrats. And that's where project preparation, including what Ziad said about ESGs, which unfortunately a lot of governments are not taking them seriously, and that takes time in order to prepare a project, to make it bankable, to make it viable, and to promote it globally. So preparation is very key to the success of a project, as well as it shows the multinationals that the project has been well conceived, that the project has been thought through. And we've seen too many failures of project going off the rail because the business case was not solid enough, because the lending opportunities were not well thought of, or because the deal structure was not well articulated before they launched the project. So ESG and other consideration, people first, in our case, Omanization, which is bringing more Omanis into delivery of these projects, are going to have to be key to successful of these projects. And unless you come up with specific strategies to address them, you're going to go to market and with a suboptimal solution, which will make your project probably not as successful as it ought to be.
Yes, and at that time, as you said, at the preparation time, that's when everybody can really get together, and the need for collaboration in the industry to make sure that you can take it from there. Absolutely. David, if I may come to you, and let's talk a little bit about the legal side of this, and laws in terms of PPP, really to create a more enabling environment. How do you suggest these actually be rolled out?
Well, obviously an enabling environment is the most important aspect, because every developer or investor, the first thing they're going to do is, if they're going to look at implementing or supporting a PPP in a country, is they're going to look at what ways there are legally to manage risk. And risk is a big element, so it would be the risk of the participating company, what are the rules? That's essentially what it's about. What are the rules for engaging? And if these aren't in place, there's too much risk there. And what is happening also is that, investors will look at countries that are right next to one another in the region. So a country that has a very well-defined enabling environment is more likely to attract investors and developers than those that don't. One thing that investors hate are surprises, and they hate the rules of the game changing while the while the project's on the go and after it's been launched. They don't want surprises after an award has been made. So this is critical, a stable foundation, a set of rules that define how it's going to move forward, and that they need to stay consistent. And I think the enabling environment is also important in one aspect, is that it also prevents political interference in projects, because you can't have a situation maybe where there's a change of government and they can just ignore the rules. So and there are countries that don't have specific national rules, like Turkey has a very, very good set of rules for the different ministries. So it's, the enabling environment policy, guidelines, all these practices play an incredibly important role in perceptions of risk and helping, the private sector consider whether they're even going to look at that country.
And this, it's a fascinating area. Ziad, I believe you're actually working on a model worldwide PPP law. Tell me a little bit more about that.
Yeah, well, actually, not me myself. I'm part of a much larger team that is at the United Nations Economic Commission for Europe. I'm vice chair of the UNEC Working Party on PPP, and the Working Party has a team of experts working on drafting a model law for PPP to be used worldwide. Of course, it would be proposed to governments. Not every government is going to take it up, but the model law is now in a very decent final stage, I think, for government-based PPP, so the PFI type approach. but we are working also on the side of it that is for user-pays PPPs, so for concessions, and that will be integrated within the existing model law. And I think this is very important because going forward, really, I mean, our advice to governments is to focus on user-pays PPPs. They've all ran up very huge deficits, especially with COVID, and right now they need to be very intelligent about how they use government financing. So user-pays PPPs are very important, and making sure to minimize the use of sovereign guarantees. And that's a very long subject also.
And when sadly, we won't have time to go into Thomas, just following on that, you know, is it absolutely essential that, you know, the legal framework, I suppose if we give it a lot of clarity to investors, which is essential too, because, you know, as you've all said, the competition for those funds, they're definitely there. Thomas.
Yeah, indeed, as an absolute requirement, there are very few jurisdictions which need a PPP enabling law. I mean, somewhere like Syria or Iraq did, because they had laws which specifically prevented the private sector from doing things like generating power. But, you know, outside of those very, very limited examples, most jurisdictions, there's no problem with, you know, if you get the right licensing for you to go off and build a power station or a hospital or whatever. But I mean, I think as the other panelists have said, the great advantage of a PPP law is giving comfort, giving confidence, and setting out that a clear framework within which developers know projects are going to be developed. So yeah, I mean, they're not necessary, but if they're well designed and followed through, they are almost always beneficial.
We've only got a couple of minutes, and I'd like to get maybe some words of inspiration from all of you. But very quickly, David, will new technology be a game changer, you know, when it comes to PPP? David, sorry.
Absolutely, and this is an area where more attention has to be given, especially in the area of how PPPs in this area will address technological obsolescence, because technology changes all the time, and there's a lot of investment up front when it comes to projects of this nature. And so there's going to have to be flexibility built into the contracts that allow innovation and adaptation during the lifetime of the project, because technology now, if it's steadfast and written into the contract, in 20 years' time, it's irrelevant.
Abraham, a quick word from you in terms of the future for PPP, and are you optimistic that we can get it right? We have to get it right?
I don't think we have a choice. We have to get it right. Otherwise, they're doomed to fail. So, but I have a word of wisdom here. Not every project should be PPP-able, if there's such a word. Therefore, the right projects will succeed. As my panelists have said, we don't have a choice. We need the private sector to innovate, to bring the technologies, to bring the funding as needed, user pay, all the stuff. But we have to be careful. Some countries have embarked on a very aggressive PPP program whereby almost everything they do is going through that funnel. And frankly, it doesn't work for a variety of reasons, whether the investors are not interested or they have too much debt on their books. So yes, I'm an optimist for the right project.
Thank you for that. And Ziad, I'm going to leave you for the closing word here on the future of PPP, particularly in the region here.
Very, very optimistic about it worldwide, and I hope the region gets it right. Especially, you know, going back to what David was saying, technology is the name of the game for any economic growth in the future, and you know, focusing PPP efforts on social infrastructure and on technological infrastructure are going to be key. So, but I trust that we will be very successful resorting to the private sector for help and you know, and getting these things done.
Super. Well, thank you all so much, and thank you for your great contributions during that session there. Really looking at, you know, public or private and what to do when we look at the opportunities that are there for the future. So Abraham, Ziad, David, thank you so much. And indeed, Thomas, once again, thank you so much for moderating the panel, and thank you for the great value added you all brought to it, and a wonderful dynamic closing panel here at the Big Five on the first day. Thank you all so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.